Predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons.
Something has changed in the Florida swamps. For years, the story of the Everglades seemed almost impossible to misunderstand. An enormous invasive snake arrived, spread through the wetlands, and began consuming animals that had never evolved to deal with a predator like it. Mammals disappeared. Food chains weakened. Places that once seemed overflowing with wildlife became strangely quiet. But new footage from Florida is forcing researchers to look at the story differently, because the latest evidence does not show a simple ecosystem being destroyed. It shows an ecosystem beginning to react. Deep inside South Florida, where water moves slowly through sawgrass and dense vegetation, cameras have been watching animals that humans rarely see directly. The footage is difficult to interpret at first. There are no dramatic explosions, no massive confrontation, no obvious turning point. Instead, there are small behaviors. A predator changing its movements. A native animal approaching something it normally would have avoided. A snake appearing in territory where it was once almost impossible to imagine one surviving. And together, those small moments may indicate that the Everglades is entering a completely different phase of its struggle. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what was lost. The Everglades was never simply a giant swamp. It was a vast, interconnected landscape in which water, plants, reptiles, birds, and mammals depended on one another. Water slowly moved through the region, feeding wetlands and helping sustain one of the most unusual ecosystems in the United States. For generations, animals occupied highly specialized positions within that system. Raccoons searched the edges of waterways. Marsh rabbits moved through vegetation. Bobcats hunted smaller animals. Alligators controlled stretches of open water. And beneath all of them was a complicated network of prey and predators that had developed over thousands of years. Then a new predator entered the equation. The Burmese python was not supposed to be there. Originally native to parts of South and Southeast Asia, these snakes became popular in the American exotic pet trade. They were impressive animals, but there was one problem that many owners discovered too late. They grew. A small snake purchased as an exotic pet could eventually become a huge predator capable of reaching several meters in length. And when owners could no longer handle them, some snakes were released. Other snakes escaped captivity. Major storms also played a role in the early history of the invasion, including Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which devastated South Florida and damaged facilities holding exotic animals. Whatever the exact origin of individual snakes, the result was the same. The Everglades provided almost everything a Burmese python could want. Warm temperatures, dense vegetation, waterways, and an enormous supply of prey. The snakes did not need to chase animals across open ground. They could wait. They could disappear into vegetation. They could move through water. They could remain hidden for astonishing lengths of time. And when an unsuspecting animal came close enough, the encounter could be over in seconds. That ability created a problem unlike anything the ecosystem had experienced before. Native prey animals had defenses against predators they had encountered for generations. They understood the smell of familiar predators. They recognized movement patterns. They knew where danger usually came from. But a Burmese python was something different. It could approach from water. It could hide among vegetation. It could remain almost completely motionless. And it could consume animals far larger than people might expect from a snake. As the python population expanded, researchers began finding evidence that the consequences were enormous. In some heavily invaded areas, populations of mammals, such as raccoons, possums, and rabbits fell dramatically. The disappearance of those animals created another problem. When one species declines, the effects rarely stop with that species. Predators lose food. Plants experience different levels of grazing. Scavengers lose opportunities. Other prey species may increase or decrease. An ecosystem is not a collection of isolated animals. It is a machine made of relationships. and the pythons had inserted themselves into the middle of those relationships. Eventually, scientists began describing something that was perhaps more disturbing than finding dead animals: silence. Researchers could travel through areas that had once been filled with signs of life and find remarkably little movement. The vegetation was still there. The water was still there. The landscape still looked like the Everglades. But something underneath the surface had changed. Florida responded with increasingly aggressive efforts to remove the snakes. Hunters entered areas that were difficult and sometimes dangerous to navigate. Specialized teams searched waterways and vegetation. Technology was tested. Traps were developed. Tracking methods were improved. Even public competitions were created to encourage people to capture Burmese pythons. But there was a fundamental problem. The Everglades was enormous, and the snakes were exceptionally difficult to find. A hunter could walk through an area containing a python and never realize the animal was only a few feet away. The snake did not have to move. It did not have to announce itself. It only had to remain invisible. That made the math brutal. Even removing thousands of snakes does not necessarily solve a problem involving a population that may number far higher. And then researchers began noticing something even more interesting. The snakes were not always behaving the same way. Places that had once produced captures began producing fewer. Some areas became unexpectedly unproductive. Hunters would return to locations where snakes had previously been found and discover almost nothing. That did not necessarily mean the pythons had disappeared. They may have moved. The possibility raised an uncomfortable question. Were the snakes beginning to avoid humans? There are several ways such a pattern could develop. Individual snakes might learn that certain areas are dangerous. Or perhaps snakes that naturally avoided human activity were simply more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those tendencies forward. Researchers cannot simply look at one snake and determine which explanation is responsible. But either possibility changes the picture, because now humans are not the only side adapting. The invasive predator may be adapting too, and that is where the story takes a much darker turn. While scientists were studying the snakes themselves, another threat was moving through the ecosystem almost invisibly. It was not a large predator. It was not something that could be seen from a drone. It was a parasite. The snake lungworm associated with Burmese pythons had entered Florida with its invasive host, and native snakes could become exposed through a complicated chain of transmission involving other animals. An infected python could leave parasite larvae behind. Small organisms could interact with that material. Frogs could consume infected hosts. Native snakes could then consume those frogs. The parasite could move through the food web until it reached another snake. Inside its new host, the larvae could eventually migrate toward the lungs. And that is where the real damage occurred. The parasite could interfere with breathing and weaken the animal. For a snake already living in an ecosystem under enormous pressure, another biological threat could be devastating. Researchers found infections in multiple native snake species, and the problem was no longer confined to one small corner of the Everglades. The parasite had demonstrated an ability to move through native wildlife. That created a terrifying possibility. Even if humans somehow removed every Burmese python tomorrow, the parasite might not disappear with them. The biological chain had already begun. The invader had brought something with it. But then researchers encountered a mystery. One native predator appeared to be responding differently. The Florida cottonmouth was present in areas where the parasite had been detected, yet researchers observed an apparent resistance that demanded explanation. Why? Was there something about its immune system? Was its physiology different? Could some chemical property inside the animal interfere with the parasite? Nobody had a simple answer. But if the resistance could eventually be understood, it might become one of the most important clues in the entire battle. Because the Everglades does not need only a way to kill pythons. It needs a way to survive everything that came with them. And while researchers were investigating parasites, something else was happening much farther north. Another snake was beginning to return. Not an invader, a native predator. a snake that had once belonged to Florida's forests long before the Burmese python became part of the story. The eastern indigo snake. It can grow to remarkable lengths, and its dark body can appear almost blue-black when sunlight hits its scales. But its appearance is not the most extraordinary thing about it. Its diet is. The eastern indigo is known for eating other snakes, including venomous species. It is a predator designed for a world where snakes are prey. For decades, however, this native hunter had been pushed out of much of its former range. Its decline was connected to the destruction and fragmentation of the habitats it depended on. One of the most important pieces of that habitat was something that might seem completely unrelated to snakes. Gopher tortoise burrows. Those underground shelters provide protection from extreme temperatures and give numerous animals places to survive. As development destroyed and fragmented longleaf pine habitats, gopher tortoise populations suffered. And when the burrows disappeared, animals that depended on them suffered too. The eastern indigo was one of them. Conservationists began working to reverse that decline. Habitats were restored. Tortoise populations were supported. Captive-bred indigos were released, and researchers waited. For years, success was measured in tiny steps. One snake survived. Another was tracked. A release site remained occupied. Then came a discovery that meant far more than another successful release. Cameras recorded young eastern indigo snakes moving through habitat where conservationists had been working to rebuild the population. They were not simply captive animals being handled by researchers. They represented something far more important, a population beginning to reproduce in the wild. After decades of absence, the native predator was showing signs that it could once again establish itself. And suddenly, two completely different stories were moving toward the same future. The Burmese python was expanding through Florida. The eastern indigo was being restored to parts of its historical range. One was an invasive predator that had transformed the ecosystem. The other was a native predator returning after years of decline. Researchers now had to consider a possibility that would have sounded almost unbelievable years earlier. What happens if their ranges eventually overlap? Would the indigo attack? Could it kill a Burmese python? Would the size difference make that impossible? Or could the indigo use the same aggressive behavior that allows it to overpower other snakes? Nobody could simply assume the answer. A full-grown Burmese python is a formidable opponent. The eastern indigo may be an exceptional snake predator, but it has not evolved alongside Burmese pythons. This would be a completely new confrontation. And even if the indigo could fight the python, another threat was waiting. The parasite. That may be the most unsettling part of everything happening in Florida right now. The animal being returned to help restore the ecosystem may be moving toward the same biological danger that arrived with the invasive snake. Conservationists spent decades rebuilding the habitat. They brought back the predator. They helped restore the conditions it needed to survive. And now the ecosystem itself may have changed while that work was taking place. The battlefield is no longer the same. The enemy is no longer just one species. And the outcome may not depend on which animal is strongest. It may depend on which species can adapt fastest. Because deep inside the Florida wetlands, something has begun to happen that nobody could have planned. The native ecosystem is no longer simply disappearing. It is responding. And some of the evidence comes from an animal that nobody expected to become part of the comeback story. A predator that weighs far less than a giant python. A predator that should, on paper, have every reason to avoid one. The bobcat. And when cameras finally captured what happened next, researchers realized that the Burmese python might have a weakness that no trap, drone, or human hunter had been able to exploit. The weakness was already living in the swamp. The weakness was already living in the swamp. It was not a machine, a trap, or another team of hunters. It was the bobcat. For years, scientists had watched native wildlife disappear as Burmese pythons expanded through South Florida. But now cameras were capturing something unexpected. Native predators were beginning to recognize that the giant snakes could sometimes be vulnerable. One of the most striking encounters involved a large Burmese python being tracked in Big Cypress National Preserve. Researchers followed its transmitter until the signal led them to a disturbing discovery. The python was dead. Nearby footage revealed that a bobcat had attacked it. The predator was dramatically smaller than the snake, yet somehow it had one. One encounter could have been a coincidence. It could have been an unusually vulnerable python, but it proved something researchers could no longer ignore. The native food web was not completely helpless. Alligators had also been observed interacting with Burmese pythons, and other predators could exploit moments when the snakes were exposed. A python is extremely effective when it is hidden and waiting, but after a large meal, it becomes slower. When crossing open areas, it becomes easier to detect, and while moving through water, it can become vulnerable from another direction. For years, humans have been trying to discover those weaknesses. Now, native predators might be discovering them naturally. That does not mean Florida has solved its python problem. Far from it. One bobcat cannot reverse decades of ecological damage. Even thousands of successful encounters would not automatically restore the wildlife that has already disappeared. But the behavior changes the story. The Everglades is no longer simply a place where one predator hunts and everything else runs. It is becoming a place where species are adapting to one another again. And that brings the eastern indigo snake back into the picture. Conservationists have spent decades trying to return this native predator to parts of Florida where it had disappeared. Young indigos are now being recorded in the wild, suggesting that some restored populations are beginning to reproduce naturally. That is a major conservation victory. But it could also create one of the strangest confrontations in Florida wildlife. The eastern indigo is a powerful snake hunter. The Burmese python is another snake, but one far larger and stronger than the species the indigo normally encounters. What happens when the two finally meet? Nobody knows. The indigo might attack. The python might overpower it. One could retreat, or the encounter might never happen. There is no reliable record showing exactly how a full-grown eastern indigo would deal with a large Burmese python. And even if the indigo could defeat the invader, another threat is moving through the same ecosystem, the lungworm. That parasite may ultimately prove more dangerous to native snakes than any direct confrontation. It does not need to overpower its host. It can enter the food web quietly and damage an animal from within. Researchers have found evidence of infection across multiple native snake species, raising concerns about how far the parasite could spread. And that creates an extraordinary race. Conservationists are bringing back a native predator. At the same time, a parasite associated with the invasive snake is moving through the ecosystem. The question is whether the eastern indigo can expand quickly enough to establish healthy populations before encountering threats it has never had to face before. There is, however, another mystery. Some native snakes appear to show resistance to the lungworm. The Florida cottonmouth has attracted particular attention because researchers have observed animals apparently avoiding the severe effects seen in other species. If scientists can determine what protects these snakes, the discovery could become extremely important. It might reveal a biological defense that could help explain why some species survive while others suffer. But until those answers arrive, Florida remains trapped between multiple threats. The python is still there. The parasite is still spreading. Habitats are still fragmented, and native predators are only beginning to respond. That is why the latest footage is so important. It does not prove that the Burmese python invasion is ending. Instead, it shows that the ecosystem itself may be changing in ways nobody planned. For years, the stories seemed to have only one direction. The pythons expanded. Native wildlife declined. Humans tried to remove the snakes. The snakes survived. Now there are signs pointing in several directions at once. Bobcats are confronting pythons. Native predators are exploiting weaknesses. Eastern indigo snakes are returning. And researchers are investigating possible resistance to the parasite. The Everglades is fighting back, but it is not necessarily winning. That distinction matters. Nature does not restore itself according to human expectations. A population can recover in one location while disappearing somewhere else. A predator can kill an invasive species without controlling its population. A conservation project can succeed while another biological threat undermines it. And that means the future of Florida's swamps may not produce a simple winner. The Burmese python could remain dominant in some areas. Native predators could gradually learn to exploit it. The eastern indigo could expand farther south. The lungworm could continue moving through native snake populations. Or an entirely different interaction could change everything. That is what makes this moment so unusual. The Everglades is no longer frozen in the aftermath of the invasion. It is evolving. A giant snake hides beneath the vegetation. A bobcat moves through the same wilderness. An indigo snake returns to ground its ancestors once occupied. And microscopic parasites travel through the food chain where nobody can see them. All of these forces are operating simultaneously. And somewhere in that enormous wilderness, another encounter is already possible. Maybe it will involve a python and a bobcat. Maybe it will be an eastern indigo confronting a snake unlike anything it has ever hunted. Maybe scientists will discover why one native species can resist the parasite. Or perhaps the next major discovery will be something nobody has even considered yet. The truth is, the battle for the Everglades has entered a new phase. The swamp is damaged. The old ecosystem has changed, but is not dead. It is adapting, and for the first time in decades, the final outcome is genuinely uncertain. The invader is still there. The native predators are still fighting. The king is returning, and beneath the surface, something else is moving silently through the food web. The cameras are still watching. The researchers are still waiting. And the next image from the Florida swamps could reveal whether this ecosystem is finally beginning to recover or whether the most dangerous chapter has not even started yet.